Chosen ones, 8 signs from your childhood that God set you apart. From the very first breath you took, something unseen was already at work in your life, before your feet ever touched the ground. The hand of God had already marked your journey. There was a reason why, even as a child, you sensed things others didn't. There was a reason why your heart broke, when others didn't even notice the pain. The world may have overlooked you, misunderstood you, or called you different. But heaven called you chosen. You see, nothing about your life has been accidental. Every tear you shed, every moment you felt like you didn't belong, every quiet whisper in the night, it was all part of a greater plan. Some of the most powerful signs that you were set apart by God were written into your story long before you had the words to describe them. While others were playing, you were pondering. While others ran freely, something in your spirit already knew that you were walking a different path. The Bible says in Jeremiah 1:5, "Before I formed you in the womb I knew you. Before you were born I set you apart." That means before any teacher spoke into your life, before your parents shaped your future, before the world had the chance to define you, God had already chosen you, and the signs have been there since the beginning. Today we're going back to the places you may have forgotten, moments from your childhood that were never random. They were holy hints from heaven, pointing to the calling you were born to carry. Let's look again, this time with open eyes. Sign 1. You felt different, even when you didn't know why. You always knew you weren't like everyone else. Even before you could put it into words, there was a quiet awareness inside you that something about you was different. Not better, not worse. Just different. While other children blended in easily, laughed without thinking twice, or followed the crowd without a second thought, you were watching, wondering, sensing. There was a depth to you, even then, a weight in your spirit that no one else seemed to carry. You may have sat alone, not because you were shy, but because the noise of the world felt too loud for your soul. You may have asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, questions they couldn't answer about God, about pain, about the meaning of life. You may have wept over things others ignored, or rejoiced over beauty that no one else seemed to notice. And maybe, just maybe, you wondered why you didn't fit, why you always felt slightly out of step, even in your own home, your own school, your own world. But that difference was not rejection. It was protection. It was not a curse. It was a calling. For the beginning, God set you apart. The reason you didn't blend in was because He never intended for you to get lost in the crowd. You weren't made to conform. You were made to transform. Romans 12:2 speaks directly to this. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That command from God explains the very feeling you carried as a child. You weren't wired to think like everyone else. You were made to see differently, feel deeply, and carry a heavenly perspective long before you understood it. That quiet ache of not belonging was actually the echo of heaven, reminding you, this world is not your home. You were not built for ordinary. You were marked for purpose. God didn't wait until adulthood to begin His work in you. He whispered to you in childhood, through feelings of being different, through silent moments where He was shaping your identity before you ever knew His name. You are not strange. You are chosen. And that difference you felt was never a mistake. It was the first sign that God was already calling you higher. Sign 2. You had an unusual awareness, a spiritual sensitivity. There was something about the way you saw the world that didn't match the way others did. While the other children ran freely, caught up in play, or distracted by noise and movement, your eyes and your heart were tuned to something deeper. You noticed things that others overlooked. The subtle change in someone's mood, the weight behind someone's smile, the heaviness in a room that no one else seemed to feel. You didn't know how to explain it, but you knew it was real. It was more than just being observant. It was a sensitivity to the unseen, a quiet awareness of something bigger than yourself. As a child, you may have walked into a place and suddenly felt a shift in your spirit. You didn't know the word for it, but your heart would tighten, your mind would stir, and you'd sense something was wrong or right. You were discerning, though you didn't yet know the meaning of that word. You may remember moments when the wind moved through the trees and it stirred something in you. A sunset that brought tears to your eyes. Silence that felt holy. It wasn't your imagination. It was your spirit responding to God's presence. Even before you fully knew Him, you were in tune with the eternal, and that is no small thing. That kind of awareness doesn't just happen. It is planted. It is gifted. It is a sign. God has always used spiritual sensitivity to awaken His chosen ones. In Proverbs 20:27, the word says, "The spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all his innermost parts." That awareness you carried, those moments where you sensed what others missed, was the lamp of the Lord shining within you, searching, stirring, speaking. It may have made you feel strange at times. You may have wondered why you reacted so deeply, why you couldn't just shake things off like others did, but that was the Spirit of God developing your discernment. He was teaching you how to see beyond what is visible, to feel the spiritual temperature of a moment, to recognize truth and deception without needing it explained. The world often teaches children to dull their senses, to push away emotion, to stop being too sensitive. But in God's kingdom, sensitivity is strength. Spiritual awareness is a weapon. It means you're not walking blind. It means you're listening for heaven's whisper, while others are lost in the noise. If you carried this sensitivity as a child, you weren't weak. You were already being trained. Yod. God had His hand on your heart, shaping you to walk by faith, not by sight. And even now, that same sensitivity is still in you. It's not something you grew out of. It's something that's been growing in you. What felt like a burden was actually a gift, a sign, a calling. God gave you eyes to see, ears to hear, and a spirit that responds to His voice. That's not ordinary. That's chosen. Sign 3. You care deeply for others, even at a young age. There's something sacred about a child who carries compassion. While others were carefree, self-focused, or even cruel, you couldn't look away from the pain around you. You noticed the lonely kid in the corner. You felt the sting of someone else's tears, even if they didn't say a word. You didn't have to be told to care. You just did. It was natural. It was in you. And it wasn't just emotion. It was evidence, a sign. From early on, your heart broke for things beyond your understanding. A wounded animal, a grieving friend, a rant's quiet sadness. You felt it all. And you didn't just feel it. You carried it. Maybe you tried to fix it. Maybe you sat quietly beside someone just to make sure they weren't alone. You didn't have the words, but you had the presence. That was the love of God already working through you. This kind of empathy is rare. It's not taught. It's birthed. It flows from a place beyond personality or nurture. It is the mark of someone who has been touched by heaven's hand. It is a reflection of God's own heart, planted deep within you from the beginning. Romans 12:15 gives us a glimpse of this calling. Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. That's not a suggestion. It's an identity. That's what you were doing, even as a child. You were stepping into the joys and sorrows of others, not because you had to, but because you were wired to love like Jesus loves. The world often calls this kind of sensitivity a weakness, but God calls it strength. He calls it readiness. You were being shaped to comfort the hurting, to notice the invisible, to reach out when others turn away. That's not just a kind heart. That's a chosen heart. If you've always carried this depth of compassion, it's because God set you apart to be a vessel of His love, a light in dark places, a reminder to others that they are seen, known, and not alone. This is more than a feeling, it's a calling. And the fact that it started in childhood is proof that God has always been working in you. Sign 4. You had vivid dreams or premonitions that came true. Somewhere in your early memories, there are dreams you can't forget. Not the usual scattered pictures of the mind, but dreams that felt real, so real, they left a mark. You may have dreamed something and then seen it happen. Or maybe you felt something was coming and couldn't explain why. And then it did. Those moments weren't strange. They weren't coincidence. They were spiritual. They were prophetic. And they were a sign. God speaks in many ways, but for his chosen ones. He often begins in the night, in the quiet, when the noise of the world fades, the voice of the Spirit speaks. And children pure in heart and uncluttered by the world hear more clearly than we realize. If you had dreams that warned, comforted, revealed, or stirred something in you as a child, don't dismiss them. Heaven was already speaking. Job 33:15-16 reveals this truth clearly. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on people as they slumber in their beds, he may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings. God was opening your ears before you even knew it. Those dreams were not the product of imagination. They were seeds of revelation. You may have seen faces you've never met. You may have dreamed of danger and then saw it avoided. You may have been given peace in a dream that got you through a storm the next day. These are not small things. These are the early signs of a prophetic gift. God was teaching you, gently, through vision, showing you that there's more to this life than what we see. For many, dreams are forgotten. But for the chosen, dreams are instructions. God was already tuning your spirit to his frequency, revealing that your purpose would require spiritual sensitivity and discernment. You weren't dreaming like others, you were receiving. If those dreams have followed you, or if you've long ignored them, now is the time to see them for what they truly are. Evidence that you were being shaped, prepared, and spoken to. Even in sleep, God was drawing near. Because when he chooses someone, he doesn't wait until they're ready. He begins before they even understand. Those visions, those holy interruptions in the night, they were God's whispers of Vesti over your life, and they are still calling you forward. Sign 5. You experienced unexplainable protection. There are moments in your story that still don't make sense. Not because they were confusing, but because you survived when you shouldn't have. You were spared when there was no logical reason. Maybe you were inches from danger and walked away untouched. Maybe something inside you told you not to go, not to speak, not to move, and that hesitation saved you. At the time it felt like coincidence, but now, looking back, you know better. You were being protected. From the time you were young, a hand you couldn't see was guiding your steps. There were moments when chaos surrounded you, but somehow you stood in peace. There were seasons when others fell into darkness, but somehow you stayed standing. You didn't have the strength, you didn't have the strategy, but you had covering. You had favor, you had angels assigned to your life. Psalm 91:11 says, "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways." That's not just poetry, that's a promise, a shield, a declaration that heaven intervenes when God's purpose is on the line. And you, even as a child, were living under that promise. You may not have recognized it then. Maybe you chalked it up to luck or chance. But now you can feel the truth in your spirit. God was watching over you. There were prayers you didn't pray, but they still reached God's throne. There were traps set against you that never sprung. There were wounds that could have broken you, but they didn't. Because your story wasn't just being lived, it was being written. The enemy saw the calling on your life long before you did, and he tried to stop it early, through fear, through trauma, through near-death moments, through confusion. But none of it worked. Why? Because you were chosen, and when God calls someone, he covers them. This protection wasn't just about survival. It was about preparation. You were preserved for a purpose, and every time the enemy tried to take you out, God said, "Not yet. Not this one. I have plans." That's why you're still here. That's why the storm didn't break you. That's why, even when everything said you should have been lost, you were found. You are not unscathed by accident. You are preserved by design. Sign 6. You felt a strong connection to God without anyone teaching you. Before you had the language of faith, before you even knew what salvation meant, you had moments where God felt real to you. Moments when somehow you just knew He was near. You may not have known the right words to pray. You may not have been raised in a deeply spiritual home, but something in you reached out to Him, instinctively, naturally, as if you were remembering a voice you'd always known. It's hard to explain this kind of connection. You just knew He was there, in the quiet moments, in the middle of the night, in places where no one else could hear you, but you believed, no, you felt, that He could. You might have whispered prayers before you even understood what prayer was, or stared at the sky and felt peace that didn't make sense, or talked to God like a friend, not because someone told you to, but because it felt right. That is not common. That is not religion. That is relationship, and it started early. Psalm 145:18 says, "The Lord is near to all who call on Him, to all who call on Him in truth." You didn't need a perfect prayer. You didn't need church language. You just needed honesty. And even as a child, you had that. Your heart was pure, your hunger was real, and God drew near. Chosen ones don't wait to find God. They're drawn to Him from the beginning, because He's already been speaking to them long before they understand who He is. You may have felt comfort during hard times that made no sense. You may have felt protected when you were completely alone. You may have heard a whisper of hope when no one else was encouraging you. That was Him. That was always Him. This early connection is a sign, a signal, a seed. You were made for intimacy with God, not just belief in Him. That's why you've always felt a longing that nothing else could satisfy. You've chased other things. You've tried to fill the void, but nothing compares to that first feeling. That simple, sacred connection you felt as a child. And that's because you were chosen for closeness, chosen to know Him, not just about Him. Then God didn't wait for you to grow up to start speaking. He began in the beginning, before you could explain it, before you could prove it. He was already near, already calling you, already planting a relationship in your spirit that no season of life could ever erase. You knew Him before you knew Him. And that is the undeniable sign of someone who has always been chosen. Sign 7. You faced great pain, loneliness, or hardship early on. There are things you went through as a child that most people never knew. Behind your smile was a weight you didn't know how to carry. Behind your quiet strength was a storm that raged inside. While others seemed carefree, you carried questions too heavy for your age. Why me? Why now? Why does it hurt so much? Maybe it was the absence of a parent, the sting of rejection, the cruelty of words spoken over you, or the burden of being the strong one when everything around you was falling apart. You were too young to understand it, but deep inside, you felt the breaking, and for years maybe you thought that meant something was wrong with you. But it didn't mean you were broken. It meant you were being built. God does not waste pain. When He calls someone, He doesn't only call them to a mission, He calls them through the fire to prepare them for it. The early hardships you endured weren't signs of abandonment. They were signs of preparation. The enemy tried to crush you early, because he saw the weight of your future. But what was meant to destroy you only deepened your compassion, sharpened your discernment, and strengthened your spirit. Romans 5:3-4 reminds us, "We also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope." That's not a verse of comfort, it's a blueprint. It's what God was doing in you all along. Every trial, every tear, every time you felt like giving up, but didn't. It was shaping you into someone who could carry the weight of calling. There's a reason you matured faster than others. A reason you looked at life with serious eyes, even when you were young. A reason your heart didn't settle for surface-level things. Pain introduced you to depth, to empathy, to God. You learned to trust God when there was no one else to trust. You learned to find peace in places others avoided. You learned to hope when hope didn't make sense. That is the strength of the chosen. That is the fire that forges purpose. If you faced hardship early, it wasn't punishment. It was permission. Permission to grow, to rise, to carry something greater than your years. God chose you, not in spite of your pain, but through it, because he knew that what the enemy used to try and break you would only prove the depth of what he placed in you. You didn't just survive, you were refined. And now, the pain that once felt like a curse is the very evidence that you were never ordinary. You were chosen, called, set apart. And every scar tells a story that says, God brought me through so I could bring others through. That's not weakness, that's destiny. Sign 8. You were drawn to spiritual things. Even as a child, there was something inside you that longed for more than what the world offered. While others were content with cartoons and games, you found yourself captivated by stories of faith, of sacrifice, of God moving in the lives of people. Something about those moments stirred you. You weren't just curious, you were hungry. You were drawn in by a pull you couldn't explain, a fire you didn't ask for, but couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the Bible stories that came alive in your imagination. You didn't just hear about David and Goliath. You felt David's courage. You didn't just learn about Moses. You saw yourself walking with him through the Red Sea. You may have found yourself asking deep questions. Not to challenge anyone, but because your spirit needed answers. You wanted to know how God works, why he calls certain people, what it means to live by faith. That hunger didn't come from you. It came from the one who created you. Hebrews 12:1 says, "Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and run with perseverance the race marked out for us." As a child, you were already being surrounded by these witnesses, by the stories of the faithful, by the voices of those who lived for something greater. And something in you said, I want to live like that. You may not have had all the answers. You may have been too young to even understand why you felt so deeply when hearing about people who lived and died for their belief in God. But that response in your spirit, that ached to be part of something bigger, that was the seed of calling already taking root. You were fascinated with truth, because your soul was made to carry it. You were drawn to courage, because you were prepared to walk in it. The spiritual didn't scare you, it stirred you. You sensed that there was more than meets the eye, that behind every story and every silence was a God who was close. And while others dismissed those feelings as imagination or emotion, heaven was smiling, because you were listening. That draw toward spiritual things wasn't a phase. It wasn't a child's fantasy. It was God awakening destiny. It was his spirit bearing witness with yours, saying, this is who you are. This is what you were born for. And if that hunger is still in you today, even buried beneath years of noise and distraction, it's because it never left. You were drawn to him then, and he is drawing you now. That pull was not your idea. It was his, a mark on your spirit, a whisper to your purpose, a sign that from your earliest days you were already walking the road of the chosen. Conclusion: you were chosen from the beginning. You've carried these signs for years, some buried deep in memory, others right beneath the surface of your heart. And now, looking back, you begin to see the thread, a holy thread, woven by God's own hand, connecting moments that once seemed random, painful, or even insignificant, but they were never meaningless. They were messages, warnings, confirmations. Every one of them was God saying, I've set you apart. I've chosen you. You weren't just a child growing up. You were a soul being prepared. The sense of not fitting in, the deep compassion, the spiritual sensitivity, the dreams, the protection, the longing for God, none of it was accidental. You were marked from the womb, just as Jeremiah was. And the Lord is bringing it all back to your remembrance now, not to make you sentimental, but to awaken you to your calling. Romans 8:28 declares, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." All things, the joys and the sorrows, The questions and the revelations, the loneliness, the wonder, the moments of peace that made no sense, and the pain that tried to crush you. God has used every detail to shape the vessel He intends to use. You didn't miss it. You haven't gone too far. The signs were never meant to stay in your past. They were planted to grow into your present. And now, the same God who called you in childhood is calling you again. Not with a whisper this time, but with clarity, with urgency, with love. You are chosen. Not because you were perfect, but because you were willing to feel, to seek, to believe, even when you didn't understand what it all meant. That calling hasn't changed. The God who knit you together still holds your future. The signs that marked your eerie life are not just memories, they are reminders that you were always His. So rise, step into what He's been preparing you for. Let your story shine. Let your difference speak. Let your life testify that the hand of God was on you from the very beginning. This is your moment, not just to remember, but to respond. You weren't overlooked. You weren't forgotten. You were chosen, and the world needs what God has placed inside of you.